So here on the Streaming Wars segment, what we talk about is anything that's happening in the world of the streaming wars. And you'd be saying, streaming wars, what's that? Well, that's the ongoing conflict, the battle that's happening between Disney Plus and Hulu and Netflix and the Peacock thing, if it ever shows up, and now the HBO Max and all of these crazy things, and all the business side, all the controversy side. I think whether I like it or not, we're going to be walking into controversy tonight. So everybody bear with us. And we're going to get into actually talking about the streaming wars. So tell me, Eric, what's your first story that you have here for streaming wars?
Well, as you mentioned, I have a controversial story that's been trending quite a bit today. And I think a lot of you have probably heard about this. It's definitely been something that a lot of people are commenting on. And a lot of people, I think, I don't know if they're overreacting or underreacting, but there's some angles to this story that you may not be aware of. So anyway, this is an Associated Press article from Yahoo News, and it says HBO Max removes Gone with the Wind, will add context. It says HBO Max has temporarily removed Gone with the Wind from its streaming library in order to add historical context to the 1939 film, long criticized for romancing slavery and the Civil War era South. So this is what I wanted to say about this. First of all, Dave and I have always said that this is not meant to be a political show. We want to take you guys away from a lot of that stuff. But sometimes we can't avoid it. There's just times when we can't avoid it. And in this particular instance, we just can't. We can't stay silent and just say, hey, this is okay. Because it's not. Now, Dave has talked about this before. There's a lot of material out there that is made, that was made in an era where racism was rampant, where the age of Jim Crow, all those kinds of things. And a lot of that stuff, that material is currently being banned. And what we've talked about is how it's important to not erase our history and to use this kind of stuff as a forum for discussion, because then we can talk about these things. We can kind of put it out in the open and say, hey, was this a honest, real portrayal of this particular group or this particular people? One thing I want to point out that I think is so ironic with this story is it's important to mention that the very first Black actor, male or woman, that ever won an Oscar, an official Oscar, not an honorary Oscar, is from this film. That's from this film, okay? So regardless of what you think about the depiction of people in this movie or anything like that, that's just a fact. That's part of our history. That's part of cinematic history. You can't avoid that. Now, the irony is when it comes to that side of it, and it comes to the issue of the validity of having this movie on this platform or not. I've never been a big fan of Gone with the Wind. I've never really liked it, to be honest with you. I've always thought it was kind of boring. I remember as a kid, it was just not something I was into. But the fact of the matter is, this is the most successful movie of all time when you adjust for inflation. It is the most successful movie of all time. It sinks Titanic. It blasts Star Wars. Okay? It is the most successful movie of all time. So my thing is, first of all, I'm not for censorship. I'm not for burying these movies. I think it's important for people to be able to see them, make their own decisions. Now, the thing that I say about people overreacting, if you notice in the headline, HBO Max is going to bring it back. What they want to do is put a warning in front of it. And they're trying to decide probably how they want to word the warning before the film starts. And if that's what they want to do, obviously they have the right to do it. They own the rights to the film. They can do what they want. But there's another angle to this that I think is kind of interesting. And I actually saw this from somebody that was posting online about this, and they were kind of musing about this situation. Because again, I think some people are kind of underreacting. Some people are overreacting because HBO is saying, well, they're going to bring it back. I'm thinking, Dave, that possibly this is a little bit of a publicity stunt, taking advantage of the current political situation to get some attention for HBO Max. What do you think of that angle, Dave?
Well, I'd have to say there's probably a really good. That's probably a really good possibility. I could see someone looking at this content and seeing what it represents in this moment in time, and realizing that they could leverage this in order to get eyeballs and people talking about HBO Max. For example, I'm surprised that they're not really promoting and leaning into Watchmen, the HBO Watchmen series, because I haven't seen it, but I know from some of the discussion of it and some of the images and stuff that were coming out of it, that I know that it actually deals with race in America, within the context of the Watchmen universe. So it makes sense. And I could see them using it primarily as a publicity ploy in order to leverage, the moment that we find ourselves in order to get attention for HBO Max. They're hoping that this story is going to break big and it's going to go viral. And so this is a way to really get people talking about HBO Max.
Which, by the way, we've kind of mentioned, people really haven't been talking about HBO Max. And certainly not in the context you would expect.
Right. And the problem with the rollout of HBO Max, we've covered here on this show, is that they kind of rolled out with a lot of content that people have already seen.
Right.
They don't have a lot of new stuff that's exclusive to the platform. They don't have a Mandalorian. They don't have a Star Trek Discovery. They don't have anything. I know they've got an Anna Kendrick show, but I know who Anna Kendrick is, but I couldn't tell you anything about that show because no one's talking about it at all.
Right.
I think people have talked more about that BSG reboot, remake, whatever the heck it is, that's going to be on the Peacock, theoretically. I think people have talked more about that. And there's just...
But they are talking about this. But they are talking about this.
Exactly, yeah.
They're absolutely talking about this. There are very strong opinions on this right now, on both sides. You know what I mean? And I think actually, generally, I think a lot of people, I even saw a quote from Whoopi Goldberg, where she was talking about like, I don't think it's right to not show this movie. She actually was advocating for having some sort of a warning or something like that. And that's up to them. They own the IP. If they want to do that, they can do that. But she was like, no, I don't think this is a good idea. You know what I mean? Taking this off of the library. But what it does is it gets people talking about a platform that right now a lot of people are not talking about.
Yeah, if they had just rolled out HBO Max with some kind of a warning on the front end from the get-go, because that's what Disney did. Disney, they have sort of like these sort of warning things that they do before it actually starts, so that people understand the context of what they're going to. Because the expression "the teachable moment," I think there's a lot to be said about that. I've mentioned here on this show that that I didn't understand what had happened during World War II with the Japanese, in America. I had no idea that they were put in camps, that the government felt like they couldn't trust them. Like, I had no idea any of that stuff had happened. And the only reason it actually came up when I was growing up, because it wasn't even taught in history class, folks. They didn't even talk about that in history class. The reason that it actually got talked about is because I wanted to watch the Batman movie serials, which are they got some horribly racist, awful stuff in those. And when we put them on, I was kind of shocked at what I was seeing. And my mom was the one who gave me context and explained to me, what had actually happened historically to the Japanese. But it was because we watched the Batman movie serials. If we hadn't watched that, I would have had no idea later on in life, when I heard George Takei talking about it, who of course played Sulu in Star Trek. When I heard George Takei talk about that and his experiences growing up, I would have had no context for that whatsoever. When I watched Karate Kid, and they get into the history of Miyagi, Mr. Miyagi, and the fact that his wife and son had basically died at one of those camps, I wouldn't have had any context for that had I not actually seen those Batman movie serials.
By the way, I think that's the first time that I even became aware of that. I think that's the first time I became aware of the internment of the Japanese was actually in Karate Kid, because I saw that when it came out of the movie theaters. And that's like my first conscious memory of that. And then I also did go to a Star Trek convention with George Takei. And I can't remember if he specifically talked about it, but I know I remember him talking about his experience going, being in an internment camp. So again, yeah, like we said, teachable moment. I did want to go back to Disney because there was a good comment from Chris Roberts in the Rogues Gallery, because you did touch on Disney. He says, well, look at Disney when it comes to Song of the South. And actually, I think that's definitely part of this conversation. I remember seeing Song of the South in the movie theater. I saw it when it was re-released, because I used to re-release Disney movies all the time when I was a kid, and you would get to go see them in the movie theater. And I saw Song of the South when I was very, very, very young. And I haven't seen it since, because that film has basically been banned, and now you can't see it. And it's funny, like I would actually love to see it again, and so that I could put it into the context of it as an adult and see, what exactly is all the fuss about. Because I saw it as a kid, and I couldn't tell you. As a kid, I liked it. The thing that I remember the most is the song Zippity Doo Dah, and I remember the interaction of the animation with live action, which is basically the beginning of CGI. This is the beginning of those kinds of techniques. It's actually a very important historical movie. And it was also one of the first movies to actually feature people of color in major roles. And that's just historical fact. Whether you think the depiction is accurate or not, or reflects society at the time or society then or whatever, those are just historical facts. It was a groundbreaking film. So it is interesting because, yeah, Disney has actually played with the idea about that, has actually been talked about. That was, of course, before everything that's been happening right now. But there was some talk about the possibility of Gone with the Wind actually being released on Disney Plus in the future with some sort of a warning on it or something like that. We'll see if it happens. Obviously, in the current political context, I'm not going to hold my breath. But in this context, I really think that maybe HBO Max is doing a little bit of a publicity stunt at the expense of everyone else and some very serious issues that are going on right now.
I could totally see that. I could totally see it being a publicity stunt. But like I said too, I think for me the big thing is that used correctly, put into context, because they talk about trying to add some context. I think given a little bit of context, I think there's something to be learned from some of this stuff. I'm not a huge fan of Gone with the Wind. About my only real attachment. I'm sorry, say again.
I think we had a hiccup either on my end or your end.
All right. All I was just going to say is that for me, I don't have a lot of attachment to Gone with the Wind. So if it's on the HBO
Me either.
Max, but
I don't. But even though I don't, it's not like a film that I really ever liked, to be honest. I mean, I've always thought it was kind of boring. That's just me, because as a kid, it just wasn't something that I liked. But that, it's a bigger issue. Obviously, it's like it's not about what I like. This film has historical significance.
Right, and I understand that. All I'm just saying is, for me personally, I don't have a lot of attachment to Gone with the Wind. My only attachment to Gone for the Wind was back in the 90s. There was a fraternity on the University of Memphis campus, or Memphis State campus, called Kappa Sigma, and they used to throw these crazy wild parties. And at one point, we were doing all the T-shirts they would sell at these crazy wild parties. And one year, I had to do a riff on the Gone with the Wind movie poster. And I eventually found an affinity and an appreciation for the artistry that went into that poster for Gone with the Wind. But that's about the limit of my affinity for Gone with the Wind.
It is a classic. It is a classic poster. The poster is absolutely iconic and classic as well. Jane mentions that she saw Gone with the Wind at a theater in a school class field trip. That was the way that she saw it. I saw it on television as a kid. I do remember watching it like on television as a kid and not being impressed. But I like action, and I like superheroes, and I like stuff like that. Although I actually do like historical drama a lot, but I like the real, more action oriented stuff where it's like a war story and stuff. And I mean, obviously, Gone with the Wind has that, but it just didn't have it, I guess, in the way that it would appeal to me as a young boy. You know what I mean? It just, to me, it's more about the romance stuff, and I just wasn't into that as a kid.